Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Sara Matchett. I am an associate professor and the director at the Center for Theatre, Dance and Performance Studies at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. I'm also the artistic director of the Mothertongue project, which is a Cape Town-based women's arts collective. So this presentation, titled Walking and Stumbling, the Aesthetic as Agitator for Activism, explores the efficacy of site-responsive performance and its contribution to embodied activism within the Mothertongue project. Now, I locate embodied activism within the field of soma aesthetics. So soma aesthetics is a term that was coined by Richard Schusterman and is, and I quote, concerned with the critical study and meliorative cultivation of how we experience and use the living body, or soma, as a site of sensory appreciation, aesthesis, and creative self-fashioning. And I close quotes. So key to my engagement with soma aesthetics as a frame for understanding embodied activism is the exploration of breath and how breath acts as a catalyst as well as a thread that connects body, voice, and imagination. So in this presentation, I focus specifically on a theatrical production created by the Mothertongue project. The work, entitled Walk, was made by a company of performance makers in response to Indian artist Maya Krishna Rao's The Walk. Rao made The Walk as a retort to the gang rape and murder of 23-year-old Jyoti Singh Pandey, who was repeatedly raped and bludgeoned with an iron rod by 6 men on a bus in Delhi in December 2012. The Mothertongue project decided, with Rao's permission, to create Walk as a response to the gang rape and murder of Anine Boysen in Bredasdorp, a small town in the Western Cape of South Africa. Both women were disemboweled and left for dead at the side of the road, and both died in hospital. Jyoti Pandey 13 days later, and Anine Boysen 6 hours later. So the process of making Walk allowed for the emergence of a series of performed installations, which involved the audience and the performers walking through the installations. And the performed responses combined live and recorded performance and sound. Now, despite South Africa's celebrating 20+ years of democracy combined with a constitution that is supposedly a celebrated example in other countries, violence against bodies who identify as women is still widespread. And I question whether, as a nation, South Africans have become numb to the violence inflicted on women daily. Have we normalized it? And these are challenges that compel the Mothertongue project to create work that viscerally provokes, that inspires people into action. So our vision for Walk converges around a sparse aesthetic that foregrounds the figure of the woman. It focuses on the 7 women-identified performers and takes into account the unavoidable physical fact of their bodies, a fact which we understand rape culture attempts to obscure or efface. So how does the disciplinary frame of soma aesthetics fit into all of this? Soma aesthetics derives from theories of the body, neuroscience, and cognitive philosophy to support its claims. As an embodied philosophical practice, it suggests that humans cultivate a heightened awareness that makes possible an embodied dynamic and affective interaction with the environment. Furthermore, it is thought that embodied encounters with the environment enable humans to make sense of their environment, to conceivably transform it. And soma aesthetic insists on viewing the body as an affective interpreter of what is occurring on a cognitive level, affective and effective interpreter. And I argue that breath is what serves to aid the process of these embodied affective encounters. Breath serves to facilitate a contagion of energy between people and things. And I'll elaborate on this later in this presentation. So my interest in soma aesthetics has led to an interest in exploring the idea of embodied activism, through performance, where the aesthetic functions as the instigator for activism. So I'm not proposing performance as activism in its didactic form, as observed in numerous public performances that employ participatory forms, where the performance routinely has a predetermined message. I am rather proposing performances that are non-didactic, that by their aesthetic characteristics are provocative, where the aesthetic of the performance is the agitator for activism, where the place or site of the performance converges with the content of the performance to generate a supplementary layer of meaning. The bodiliness of the encounter is what produces a continued feeling of purpose and action in the world for both performers and audiences, where the performances activate felt perception in the bodies that experience it. So the idea of the aesthetic being able to activate felt perception in the bodies of the performers and the audience associates with the Greek word aesthetikos, which means of sense perception. And this exploration has directed me to consider how live performance can inspire a sense of profound contemplation, perhaps what could be termed embodied reflection, where the bodies of those encountering the performance are viscerally affected by the aesthetic. So live performance as activism does not necessarily evoke the kind of mass rally activism that registers when one thinks of protest action globally, but rather it incites conversations, discussions, dialogues, or debates that stimulate people to consider their role in the situation and how they can actuate from a point of felt perception and personal observation to personal embodied action. Each repetition of a live performance is fashioned by the various responses from audience members, as well as the different spaces in which it is performed. And this connects with UK-based performer and researcher Emma Meehan's ideas that the process of co-creating actively facilitates and incorporates the audience's own experiences in a collaborative act of meaning making. So this notion of collaborative meaning making is crucial to performance activism that strives to inspire a sense of embodied reflection that will conceivably point to personal action or activism in the bodies of those who encounter. So collaborative meaning making associates with ideas of co-sensing and presencing. And in my view, the act of co-creating and collaborative meaning making with the audience through performance is initiated by the performer. To activate this, the performer is required to be somatically present. And this requirement calls for an embodied relationship with self and others. The word presencing is a combination of presence and sensing at the level of felt perception or feeling in the body. It embraces practical embodied ways of understanding what it means to be somatically present and how it connects with affective encounters. And these sentiments correlate with Schusterman's argument for the cultivation of somaesthetics as a way of life, which supports his reasoning to evolve the body as a, and I quote, primordial instrument in grasping the world so that we can learn more of the world by improving the conditions and uses of the body. Close quote. Schusterman recommends engagement with practices that integrate somatic postures as a way of developing a balanced soma that functions as an energetic unit. Additionally, Schusterman emphasizes the potential that a heightened somatic awareness can have for reading other sentient beings with whom we engage. In essence, what he is proposing is that through a heightened sense of awareness of the somatic self, through the cultivation of somatic, excuse me, through the cultivation of somatic practices, our awareness of how others are feeling in their somata is made possible. So a significant part of the theatre and performance work that the Mothertongue Project undertakes focuses on practically employing what it means to be somatically present to enhance the live sensorial presence of the performer with themselves and ultimately with an audience. And this entails a great deal of work on exploring the relationship between breath, body, voice, and imagination. In my experience, somatic presencing implies having an acute awareness of the interior sensation of breath in the soma. The interior sensation is made tangible by a connection with the breath. If one observes their breath, they become acutely aware of the felt sensations in the body. And if this is the case, then breath awareness is a justifiable way of experiencing felt resonance in the soma. The breath moves beyond the body of the self to the body of others and to things in a cyclical fashion. So the breath is what connects the self to others and the self to things, thus enabling what theatre theorist Rhonda Blair refers to as imaginative immediacy and presence. Body theorist Lisa Blackman's view on the concept of becoming, which, and I quote, like the paradigm of embodiment, refuses the idea of separation, in this case between the self and other, a close quote, is appropriate here. She further asserts that, and I quote, the mixing and interconnection between self and other does not reveal an authentic separate realm, but rather the capacity we all have for being affected and affecting the other. And that permeability and connectedness rather than separation and self-contained individualism are what defines our encounters with others. Close quote. Awareness of breath, I argue, is what facilitates experiences of permeability and connectedness with self and others. This is what enables an affective encounter between audience and performer, an encounter that allows space for the aesthetic to inspire action. So my specific interest as a performer and as a theater maker, performance maker, as educator, as curator, director, is in how breath as an aesthetic that associates with sense perception or aesthetikos can inspire embodied reflection that leads to action. So my particular performance intervention for Walk deliberately engaged the theory and practice of the Sanskrit performance system of rasa, as taught to me by one of my mentors, the late Vinapani Chawla, the founder of Adishakti Laboratory for Theatre Art Research in Tamil Nadu, India. So in Sanskrit performance traditions, rasa is the experience of emotions aroused in the audience by the performer. And my knowledge of rasa in the context of performance is that it can be interpreted as a sensation perceived in the body of the performer and sequentially in the bodies of the audience. So the rasa breath patterns I learned while at Adishakti included a way to producing emotions that involved a triadic association between breath, posture, and facial expressions. And an engagement with the system of rasa requires heightened awareness that makes possible an embodied dynamic and affective interpretation, as per Soma aesthetics call. Interpretation and interaction. The practice of rasa in performance, in my view, falls within the discipline of Soma aesthetics in that it advocates for a body-centered approach to understand the aesthetic flavor that evokes an emotional or felt perception in the audience. Now, according to 10th and 11th century Indian philosopher, theologian, and mystic Abhinavagupta, rasa is the audience's aesthetic experience of the emotion portrayed. The way of accessing, producing, and showing emotion, which is first encountered in the body as sensation, is via the breath. Breathing in this context is conceivably a tangible activity that induces an experience of rasa in both the performer and the audience. If one closely takes note of one's breathing in different emotional states, very distinct physiological patterns or formations associated with the breathing pattern may be discerned. And I argue that audience members mirror the breath patterns and thus feel the rasa in their bodies, which sequentially gives rise to a visceral and embodied experience of emotion. And Chawla refers to this as a contagion of energy between performers and audience. And this conceivably connects with the field of Soma aesthetics. The body receives and feels the performance before it is cognitively made sense of, as opposed to the mind cognitively receiving and making sense of it. Breath, in this instance, is the transmitter of feeling, and more specifically in the context of Walk, the aesthetic that provokes activism. So the employment of the system of rasa in my walk performance installation affirms the idea that breath as an aesthetic that is experienced as sense perception has the potential to affect activism. And the notion of breath as an aesthetic is inspired by aesthetikos, or sense perception. The breath in this context serves as a conduit for affective encounters. Now, the aesthetic encounter between the performers and the audience is about how we build a particular kind of atmosphere or feeling in the bodies of the audience members and the performers. For performance makers, facilitators, and performers in the Mothertongue project, it is the grounds upon which we build for the intentions of what we want to achieve with the performance. As performance makers, facilitators, and performers, we are required to be conscious of creating, provoking, and inciting change through a visceral and embodied encounter with an audience. It's not didactic. It's not message-driven. It's not behavior change. It's a bodily experience of what we're trying to convey. It thus has the potential to affect individuals differently, to provoke individuals differently. And by identifying it as such, we recognize a diversity of experiences. So the ways that performers and makers need to be aware of creating, provoking, and stimulating change is through a visceral experience of an audience. It is the embodied visceral experience of what we're trying to convey. Overall, a message feels fixed as opposed to working with the aesthetic, which feels more fluid and malleable enough to honor and embrace individual experiences as opposed to contextual experience. In this way, the aesthetic has the potential to touch individuals differently. And by naming it a provocation, a diversity of experience is acknowledged, even those experiences that provoke discomfort. So leading on from this is a question around the role of provocation concerning agency, and in what sense should or does performance leave one with a feeling of agency? Now, the notion of provocation in theater and performance is complex because, according to my understanding, provocation in itself does not lead to a particular outcome. What people choose to take from the provocation is an entirely different thing. It begs the question as to what kind of agency one allows the audience within the experience of provocation. Is it, I feel traumatized, inspired, angry enough to do something? And as a maker, curator, and performer, I'm not always sure how the provocation lands, especially if it is through an aesthetic, which, as alluded to above, is a much more unreliable indicator of an outcome because it relies on the integrity of someone else's experience. It relies on the interpretation of someone else's experience. It does not rely on the performer or the curator's understanding of what they are presenting, which is in general what performance is about, but more so when one engages the aesthetic as a provocateur, because it leaves a much broader scope for experience and interpretations. And my sense is that if perceptual experience in the body is aroused, it means as makers and performers, we have touched our audiences. We have viscerally moved something inside them. What they do with the experience or how they process it is up to them. And this is where the discussion around agency enters into the debate. In conclusion, by employing the framework of soma aesthetics to understand embodied activism and the notion of the aesthetic as agitator for activism, the evolution of a heightened awareness that makes it possible to foster an embodied dynamic and affective engagement with the environment is crucial. It is through these embodied and affective encounters that we as humans are able to make sense of our environment and thus be afforded the opportunity to transform it. My central argument is that breath is the key to these affective encounters, where breath is understood as a catalyst, as a transmitter, and as an aesthetic. Thank you.
Speak, speak, speak. Speak, 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 speak. Ears splitting and vulgar, summoning their walks to hearken. Bitter taste, speak. Vomit the gag, amputate the festering wound inflicted on you. Speak. Stifle silence. Murmur exit signs. Wave your mouth frantic, frantic, frantic. Wide open, wide open, wide open. Slit in the middle. Stride your tiptoe, gushing from the pit of tunnels. In the dark, in the park, on the bus. Scrape your way into the morning if you must. For they have come to bury us, paraphrase us, erase us, demean us, diminish us, walk on us, walk in us.